Today's stories do contain some disturbing subject matter, and viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, please go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. Hello, Raven. I've been a fan of your stories for a while now, and I've particularly enjoyed the trucker stories that you've done. And while my story may not be a trucker story, it was one where I was on the road, and I thought I should go ahead and share it with you and your audience. This was a long time ago. I don't want to say when exactly, as it would date me, and I don't like to think about how old I am. Let's just say it was a number of years ago at this point. I've never shared this story anywhere else online, but maybe by sharing it, I could help out others that could be in potentially dangerous situations. It was sometime in the middle of autumn when this happened. It wasn't too cold yet, but it was starting to hit that point in the fall where it starts to rain a lot, and the rain is really cold. Like when the weather is wanting to shift over to snow, but it isn't quite there yet. You live in the Midwest. You know what I'm talking about. It was starting to get dark, and I was driving home from a long day at work, and I was just kind of staring off at the road, trying to keep myself from dozing off until I got home. The sun was starting to set. There was a light fog that was trying to lift itself up through the rain, and really, it was just a lovely autumn scene. I live a bit out of the main town that I'm near, so I have to take some back roads to get to my neighborhood, meaning that I don't really run into a lot of traffic, be it other cars or foot traffic. I rounded one of the corners near my home, and as I did, I noticed a man walking a bit up the road with his hand outstretched, like he was waving at me. My first thought was, this guy needs help, and I've always been a compassionate guy. So, despite the inherent risk, I figured there was no harm in at least pulling over to see if he was okay, or if it was an emergency. I couldn't have lived with myself if I drove by and then found out that it was something serious that I could have helped with. I pulled over, and I rolled down the window asking the man what was going on, if he needed help. He looked like a pretty normal guy. Longer, slicked back hair, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, business casual looking clothing, and a well-trimmed but thick beard. This may sound weird to some, but if I had to stereotype him, I would say that he looked like the kind of guy that would work at Best Buy for the Geek Squad. I know that sounds kind of weird, but that's where I would place him if I had to. As soon as I rolled down the window and asked if he was okay, he leaned into the window. He asked if he could get a ride to town, which was about 6 or so miles in the opposite direction. I asked whereabouts in town he needed to go, and he mentioned a small apartment complex on the opposite end, which wasn't too bad. I knew the area, as it was the complex that I lived in before I bought my house, so I told him that I could go ahead and give him a ride. He mentioned that he didn't have any money or anything that he could give me for it, and I told him that I didn't care, and I was just happy to help him get out of the rain. He shot me a smile, thanked me for my generosity, and then pulled the door open. He tossed a backpack into the back and sat in the passenger seat. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, so I wasn't really feeling threatened by him. He seemed pretty relaxed, so really it was just a matter of getting him there and trusting that he wouldn't pull anything crazy. I pulled into a driveway, turned around, and headed back. And while I was driving, I tried to make some small talk. He seemed pretty willing to talk about things, so, again, I wasn't really getting any red flags. I asked him his name. He told me that his name was Alan. I asked him why he was out walking in the rain like that, And his answer was vague, but was basically, I was told I wasn't welcome where I was anymore. I assumed that this meant that he was just kicked out, and I wasn't going to push it. After this, though, I noticed that his answers started getting shorter, or he would just chuckle slightly when I would say something and his focus just stuck to the road that we were driving on. Like, his eyes almost started to look vacant, and his smile was just a flat frown as he kept his head looking forward. After driving a bit more, the rain really started to pick up, and it was getting to a point that I was struggling to see where I was going. I mentioned that the storm was getting pretty bad. He sort of grunted in response, and I followed it up with, if you could, just point out where I need to turn. I don't want to miss it. After I said that, he lifted his hand and motioned to a parking lot by what used to be a gas station, but was vacant at this point. He softly asked me to pull over into the parking lot, and I confusingly obliged. I wasn't sure why he wanted me to do so, but I guessed that he'd had his reasons. I pulled in, and parked the car, and assumed that he was going to say something or just get out. He sat there for a few very uncomfortable seconds. And like I mentioned, I wasn't physically threatened by this man, but this was, well, it was unsettling. The dead look on his face, the fact that he was just sitting there silently and staring at nothing. I asked if he was okay, and I could see that he was starting to cry. Like tears were welling up in his eyes and falling down his cheek. I felt bad, but at the same time, this whole thing was very weird. After just staring for a few more seconds, he turned to look at me with an unnerving intensity, the tears still streaming down his face. He very quietly asked me what my name was, and I told him, just saying, "Oh, it's, then my name." He kept his stare on me and nodded slowly, like he was agreeing that it was my name or something. A few more silent seconds passed by until he spoke again, and when he did, he said, "Well, I want you to know that you're lucky. You're not the one that I'm looking for tonight." He then reached behind himself to grab his backpack, shoved my door open, and just walked away from the car out into the storm. I was left shaken and confused, completely unsure of what the hell had just transpired. I watched him walk out into the rain and continue down the road, but after a few seconds I realized that I needed to get away from there, just in case he changed his mind. I threw it in reverse, and I drove off with my hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. I spent the rest of the drive home with my heart racing, just trying to process what he meant and who he was. Over the years, I have oftentimes wondered about Alan and what that meant. Who was he looking for? What was he planning on doing to the person he was looking for? And what would have happened if I had been that person? The memory of the whole thing still haunts me, and it made me way more cautious when dealing with strangers. I can tell you that I've never picked up another hitchhiker since that day. I'm not saying that every person is like Alan, and maybe he wasn't even saying that in a threatening way, but I am saying that being vigilant and trusting your instincts can potentially save your life, or keep you out of these kinds of situations. My simple act of kindness could have potentially been a brush with something malicious. And because of it, I now have this chilling story of a hitchhiker that scared the hell out of me. I like to believe that I'm a fairly careful person, and that I do a pretty good job keeping myself out of trouble and away from dangerous situations. That said, As much as I've done a good job at keeping myself safe, I have one thing that happened to me that was genuinely terrifying. And while I wasn't personally hurt, it still messed with my head. It was one of those moments that you never think you'll end up in the middle of, and afterwards, it just kind of sticks with you and creeps up into your mind while you're lying in bed at night. The day that this happened, it was in the middle of summer. I had literally just turned 18 a couple days prior, and had spent a couple of days at my friend's house in a nearby town. I was actually driving home in the mid-afternoon. I think it was around 3 p.m. or so. I had the windows down and the wind blowing through the car because of how nice it was, and was just jamming out to some summer pop song, enjoying the drive. As I was driving down a quiet and slightly rural road, I noticed that there was a young woman down the way with her thumb outstretched, which I honestly didn't know was a thing people did. I thought that the whole thumb thing out on the road was a movie cliche, but there she was. And she looked to be in her early 20s, long, dark hair, and a simple and quite cute sundress. Though I was always warned about the dangers of picking up strangers, something about her seemed harmless. She almost looked like my little sister, just older. So I guess part of me saw some familiarity in her and immediately thought, if my sister was out on the road like this, I would want someone to stop for her to see if she was okay. I decided to stop and see if she just needed a quick ride down the road, or if she needed to go a long distance. She told me that she was needing a ride to a specific gas station about 10 miles up the road. It was in the direction that I was going, and I would have passed by it anyways, so I told her to hop in and said that I could get her there. At first, the conversation was incredibly casual and friendly. She told me her name, I told her mine. We chatted about the weather and how absolutely gorgeous it was that day. She made a comment about the song that was playing on the radio. I don't remember what song it was, but it was some top 40 song, and she was nodding along to it, singing quietly. She even told me a bit about who she was, how she was a bit of a vagabond, and she was doing an experiment to see how far she could go on the kindness of others. This was before van living was a thing, so it was a bit of a foreign concept to me, and I was shocked that it was working out the way that it was for her. After a bit of chatting and friendly back and forth, she started talking about how much she liked to listen to true crime podcasts and such. It started with her saying that, being out and alone like this, she listened to them to be aware of the horrible things that could happen. But then she started talking more and more about various murders, cold cases, and such, to the point that I could tell that she was a bit obsessed. I don't mind true crime stuff. It's not my favorite, but I was willing to hear her out because she was very clearly passionate about them. However, it shifted from her talking about the podcasts to her talking about very specific cases in very, very vivid detail. The way that she got excited when she talked about the people dying, it made me feel a bit uneasy, to say the least. She then turned to me and literally asked, "What do you think it feels like to die?" If she had just made the comment, it would have been one thing. But she said it, turned to me, and just stared at me like she really wanted an answer. I sort of just stammered and mumbled that I didn't know, and that I guessed it would just be painful. She laughed and commented that it would probably be the best feeling you could ever have, because, in her words, it would be the final explosion at the end of all the build-up and hype. Then, it got worse. She turned back to me and said, "I wish that I could find out what it felt like, without actually dying." And she seriously smiled at me, like she was expecting me to volunteer to help her. I just sort of said, "Huh, yeah," and tried to keep going without making eye contact, thinking that maybe she would get how creepy she was being. But she followed that up with, "If I asked you to help me, would you?" I was pretty obviously taken aback, and I told her that I would not be able to help her and said sorry, and that I just kind of wanted to focus on driving. She fell back into her seat and said, "Well, alright," before just turning to focus back onto the road ahead of us. And this made the whole situation feel super awkward and heavy. Like, how do you come back from that kind of comment? Well, her idea of coming back from the comment was to literally throw the door open and jump out of the car while I was going 50 down the road. She opened the door, undid her seatbelt, and just jumped out onto the road while I was going full speed. I slammed my brakes and screamed as she jumped, the whole situation playing out in a horrible series of chaotic seconds. I threw the car in park, grabbed my cell phone, and then ran over to check on her. She was pretty messed up, but was definitely still breathing. I called 911 and told them about what happened. They sent an ambulance and a few police officers, as this was definitely a suspicious situation. For some reason, the memory of them lifting her onto the stretcher to get her into the ambulance is seared into my brain. Just seeing them trying to lift her gently so as to not further her injuries. I could tell that she had broken a few things, though, and it was not pretty. I had to explain to the police that she wasn't a friend, and how I had just picked her up and was giving her a ride. They looked at me like I was crazy. Part of me thinks they were debating whether or not they were thinking I shoved her out of the car. I explained what she said right before she jumped, and after a while I think they got the idea, and maybe they realized, with how distraught that I was, that it wasn't my doing. They did call me back a few days later and asked me to come in to give an official statement, and I was actually informed that they were treating this as an attempted suicide, and that they were needing my statements to help get her into a mental health hold. I gave them what they asked for, and that was the end of it. I have absolutely no idea what happened to this girl, and I'm terrified to think that she may not be with us anymore. She was such a sweet young lady when we started talking, but she switched over to the crazed person in literally a second. I do hope that they were able to get her the help that she needed, and that she was able to continue on her trip to wherever she was going. But this event really instilled a strong lesson in me about not judging a book by its cover. Hello, long-time lurker, first-time poster here. After having spent hours reading so many truly terrifying tales on this forum, I finally decided that it wouldn't hurt to share my own, and that maybe it could help others stay out of similar situations. This happened to me a very long time ago, and it still haunts me to this day, and it's the reason that I vowed to never get into a car with a stranger ever again. I won't even get an Uber because of the possibility of something like this happening again, and I'm way beyond college-aged now. At the time, I was a deeply broke college student. I had made a very dumb mistake of going home to my very unsupportive parents for the holidays that year, and that was a mistake that I will never live down because of all this. It's not really relevant to the story, but I'm not the person that my father wanted me to be. I live a lifestyle that he abhors, and he was very clear that because I'm quote-unquote different, he no longer loved me, and that, to him, I was dead. Then, that year, I thought I would go ahead and get a bus to make the long trip to them to surprise them for Christmas. That lasted about a day. My father refused to talk to me, and the only time he did say anything to me was to tell me that he wished I would keel over so that he never had to see my face again. Of course, my mother was never willing to go against his wishes, so she just sat there and let him say it. Sorry, this was a bit of a tangent, but it does show that my home life was tumultuous to say the least. Longer story short, after that first night, my father told me to get out. So I did. I grabbed my bag and I walked out the front door. The only problem with that was that I didn't have a lot of money, and now I needed to get all the way back to my apartment, which, if I had to walk, was going to be a very, very long walk. Add that on to the fact that this was December, and it was snowing. It was more likely that I would end up dead on the side of the road about a quarter of the way there. So, I did the next best thing. I decided that I would trust some random stranger to get me at least part of the way there, or somewhere that I could afford to take a bus to get closer and then repeat the cycle. After about an hour of walking and waving down cars as they passed, an older rusted pickup truck actually slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I was a little hesitant, but the cold wind was absolutely making me less susceptible to red flags. When I got to the window, it was a middle-aged looking man with a scruffy beard, older, and slightly tattered clothing, including the generic lumberjack plaid overshirt. He looked like someone you would expect to drive an old, slightly rusted-out pickup truck in the middle of December in the Midwest. He reached over, rolled down his window, and asked where I was headed. I told him that my destination was where I lived, but then said that I would appreciate literally going anywhere in that direction. He then said that he could probably get me about halfway if I could spare a few bucks for gas. I told him I could do that and tossed my bag into the back, under his tarp, and then I hopped into the passenger seat. As we began down the road, the conversation was cordial enough. He was making small talk about himself, what he did, asking me what I was doing out in the cold. I told him that it was a family thing, and that I was no longer welcome at home anymore. He sort of scoffed when I said that, and then said something about how parents aren't supposed to abandon their kids. I noticed that, as he was talking though, he kind of kept glancing over at me. His eyes lingering a bit, his hands kept hitting the seat near my leg. I was really hoping that I was just imagining it, and maybe he was just really relaxed with strangers and talked a lot with his hands. But I kept my guard up a bit more than normal. My instincts were starting to tell me that something was a bit off. After a little while, he kind of circled back to the family question, asking me what the family dispute was about because I had been a bit vague when he asked the first time. I mentioned that my dad was less than accepting of who I was, and he kept prying, asking what it was about me that my father had an issue with. I tried to dance around it a bit, but after being asked numerous different ways, I had to just tell him that it was because of my sexuality. My dad was unhappy with the fact that I was gay, and that, because of it, he had disowned me. I will say that, when this happened, the world was a lot less accepting of people, which is why I was a bit evasive of the question. After I said this, the man nodded and basically reiterated that a parent should never abandon their child, which made me let my guard down, just a little bit, thinking that maybe he was on my side. Of course, the bells started ringing when the man took a turn onto an exit ramp off the highway, and then started down a bit more into a remote area. As he drove, I started to take in everything around me, noting various buildings and landmarks just in case things went south. I won't say what he said to me next, but I will say that, despite his comments about how it was wrong that my parents didn't accept me, He very clearly did not accept me either, and he knew that my life was in his hands. Then, he mentioned that he was sorry for what he had to do because I seemed like a nice enough kid, but he didn't have a choice. I tried to play dumb and ask him what it was he meant, and he kind of just laughed and started to reach for something in the center console of the truck. I knew exactly where this was going to go, and thankfully at this point he had pretty much slowed down to a stop, so as he reached, I unlocked my door and I hit the ground running. As soon as I jumped out, I could hear him screaming at me, yelling about how I wasn't going to get far, and that me running was just going to make it hurt more. I ran in the direction of where I knew the nearest buildings would be, and I did what I could to hide in the trees off to the side of the road to make sure that he didn't find me. I have no idea how the hell I got away, but I did. Honestly, I'm not even sure if the man really looked for me or if he had just accepted that I had gotten away and that he had successfully scared the hell out of me. The part that really sucked was that I had to leave my bag in the back of his truck, so I lost all of my clothes. I had my wallet on my person, so at least he didn't get that. I took a few minutes in the woods to catch my breath and just waited out, but then started off toward the gas station that I had noted earlier. Thankfully, nothing further really happened. I got to the station, and I told the clerk what happened, and he offered to call the police for me. I took him up on this offer. The cops showed up, and I tried to tell them what happened, but of course they didn't really seem to care. Because I was making a report on this, though, they did offer to drive me to the station, and then from there I could at least get to the bus stop and wait for the next bus. If nothing else, the guy had driven me quite a bit closer, so it was much easier for me to get home from there. I never hitchhiked again after that, like I mentioned above, and I got a really good lesson on trusting people. Some people have this deep, ingrained hate that they will not let go of, no matter how friendly they are. Obviously, I got home okay after that, but I pretty much never went anywhere that wasn't available by a bus, and I got my own car soon afterwards, so that I could just drive myself. To anyone out there that reads this, please do be careful, and remember that not everyone, no matter how polite, will be a good person. Trust your gut, find alternative ways to travel, and do everything you can to avoid situations that don't feel right. So that, my friends, was a collection of 3 scary hitchhiker stories. Be they from the perspective of the hitcher or the hiker, don't think that's how that works, but we're going to go with it. They were definitely some creepy stories. Yeah. I don't really have a personal story to tell at the end of this, though I do remember that back whenever I worked at Blockbuster, there was an employee whose name I think was Eric. I don't really remember. Anyways, he was downtown, and he ended up picking up a guy who said he needed a ride, and the guy robbed him at knife point, so I remember that much. What's weirder is that after this man was in his car and robbed him at knife point, took his phone, wallet, and such, he then came into work. Eric actually showed up to work that day because he was telling my boss, the manager, about the situation. I would assume he obviously made a police report. I don't know exactly how that played out. I just remembered being there whenever he was telling Jason about how he was just robbed at knife point. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would have showed up to work the same day, but he did. So kudos to him. He showed up to Blockbuster to do his shift. So anyways, there's my personal addition to this. Take it or leave it, your choice. hopefully you all enjoyed these stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. I would appreciate that. If you're new to the channel and enjoyed what you heard and want more content like this or content that is vastly different, please consider subscribing. I do post videos typically 3 times a week. And yeah, if you're feeling ever so bold, you can go down below the video to where the comment section is. Leave me a comment. Let me know how you're doing. Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker? Do you have a hitchhiker story? Have you ever had to hitchhike and had to deal with somebody who was the hitcher that was scary? So I don't think that's how it works, but we're going to say it's the hitcher and the hikers. That's what hitchhiking is. You got hitchers and hikers. Hitchers are the ones in the cars. Hikers are the ones on the road. There you go. Does that sound reasonable? She nodded. So it's reasonable to me. Okay. Yeah. You can also do the super thanks to tip the video if you so choose. Patreon membership gets early access to contents like this. And all that. All that said, friends, I do hope you're having a beautiful week so far. I do hope that I see you again soon. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please never forget it. And until I see you again, much love, and sleep well.